Ci troviamo nel Digital Scholarly Lab della Brown University, nella biblioteca Rockefeller, in compagnia di Rod Coover, che insegna nel Dipartimento di Media e Cinema dell'Università Temple in Pennsylvania, dove dirige il programma graduate della università, e ci troviamo con lui che è in visita come artista in residenza qui a Brown per una settimana, impegnatissimo in una serie di conferenze, seminari e workshops, laboratori, e ci troviamo a parlare dei suoi progetti. E la prima domanda che rivolgo a Rod ha a che fare con il suo progetto in corso, che è ambientato alle foci del fiume Delaware, e che coinvolge una combinazione di vari media, incluso in particolare quello che potremmo chiamare il media panoramico interattivo. So Rod, the first question I have, can you tell us a little bit about your current work in progress project, and in particular the one how various aspects of media and also of field work and your own contribution as an artist come into play into it.
Sure, Massimo. It's exciting to be able to show the work here because we have this beautiful panoramic screen, and I tend to work in very wide imagery that requires an unusual settings to look at them, very wide computer settings, multiple video screens, so it's a tremendous chance here at Brown to show this work. I've always been interested in this merger of panorama, essentially a 19th century concept, and how it's been re-envisioned in computing. And what happens when you merge panorama with maps and with video to create dynamic panoramas, panoramas that you can imagine walking in, the way that maps allow you to imagine walking into spaces. So there's a way that looking at a map and looking at a panoramic photograph or panoramic setting merges different ways of thinking about what I consider a spatial practice of walking or navigating. So over the last 15 years or so, I've been creating different kinds of maps and panoramic environments, bringing them together, and then animating them, layering on film recordings that I've done out in the different settings I've worked in, putting those video recordings on top of the maps, and creating topographies that are living, panoramas that come to life. So it's very exciting to be able to show that here, and I would like to talk specifically about the project I'm working on now, which is a project I began in the Delaware River, which is the largest industrial center in the East Coast of the United States. It was really the heart of the 19th century industrial revolution. So it carries with it the history and, in a sense, the cadavers of a 19th century history, the decaying buildings, the old tanks, the docklands that are now just posts of wood sticking up. And to look at this, I went through waves of research and then artistic creation and then story creation. And what I've liked about working in these kind of formats is it lets you do all of those things together. So I went out in the Delaware River beginning the research on kayak. I boated up and down the river, took photographs, and I did the entire stretch from the very top of the estuary where the tidal waters come at Trenton, past the cities of Florence and Burlington and Bristol and Philadelphia and Camden, down into where the estuary waters get very wide, and there are lots of big tanker ships, oil tanker ships, Marcus Hook, Paulsboro, Wilmington, and out in toward the tip of the estuary, Cape May and Cape Henlopen, with their two lighthouses where the ships head out to sea. And because of its long history as an industrial center, it has layers of where factories have decayed, new ones have been built, old docks are decaying and new ones are next to it and newer ones are next to it. And as I was kayaking, I began to wonder what will happen in an age of climate change as sea waters rise and the waters wash over that landscape. And instead of taking the pollution away, flood waters wash the pollution into the city, into where I live, into where I have my children. What kind of landscape would that be? And that's what began my project, which is in a sense, a kind of contemporary investigation of climate change on a panoramic topography that I created.
Can I ask you, is this a highly populated area still, or is that a post-industrial landscape?
It's a bit of both, because Philadelphia had reached its peak in the 1920s. And it went through a tremendous decay after that because of the collapse of steel and coal, which were its primary industries. But it's still an area, one of the most densely populated areas in the American continent. The watershed of the Delaware River, which is what I'm looking at, supplies water to about 10 million people. Philadelphia alone has a population between 4 and 5 million. So it's not as large now as New York and Newark, or it's being rivaled by the big cities in the South like Miami, but it remains a huge industrial center. Meanwhile, like other cities in what's the so-called Rust Belt, there are vast areas that are semi-abandoned, which is also tragic to see, that instead of repurposing the land, it's just left to rot. And it's that sense of decay, but an ongoing living decay that I find also interesting to photograph, to imagine, well, where does that go in 20 years? As that decay keeps setting in, but is not completely abandoned either.
So you go out on your kayak along the shore and you take your photographic equipment with you, is that, or just take notes?
So the first round of research was to go and shoot panoramic photos. And in fact, you can see one here on the web image that's also behind us, of a refinery at the water's edge. And I was recording these, and these would become part of the data set for the project. And then I was taking notes on kayak, and also with teams of students, we would walk along the shoreline. And from that, we began to create a map. And on a link called the chemical map, we created a vast database of all of these petrochemical companies and cleanup sites from old industries that were in the flood zone of 20 feet or less to seawater level. Imagining that a large storm like Hurricane Sandy and the increase of waters from climate change would mean that waters would wash over these sites. And we went out and we found out what each company made in terms of their chemical productions, their names, and I would go down and boat by these sites, and here going in on the map you can see, I would boat along these sites and photograph areas where we had markers of things to take a look at, different kinds of industries. This is an old Navy yard where they had left lots of residue from the shipbuilding in the era of World War II. And from that, I also created this very detailed map. And this map shows the actual chemicals that are produced at each of these sites. So what would be found on the ground as the tide waters would wash over. And this too is a kind of panorama. It allows one to see, to in a sense navigate the river and follow all the different sites within the flood zone. And here I've followed the flood line topography to show not only the companies along the river, but the chemicals they produce. And that this would become a database for making a panoramic narrative. So this is, on top of this, is what we tell a story about. And the story is making it human. It's imagining how these spaces actually are populated. And I took two ways of doing that. One was what might be considered a documentary approach, creating my own narrative, looking at this coastline, taking observations, seeing what I saw. And as I did that, the project took a special turn, because I realized during my research that this coastline, which was going to be flooded, had a lot of resemblances to the coastline that I grew up in England, near the Thames, which is also subject to tremendous flooding, and the village I grew up in is likely to wash away. The house I grew up in is on a rocky shale coastline, very foggy, classic English setting. You could hear foghorns always. There was always shipwreck debris on the beach. And so my story, my memories were brought here, and then I thought, well, yes, the erasure of a landscape is also the erasure of memory. And having to be displaced, having to build again, is to lose everything you had in the past. And how do we map memory? Well, to create a map that would hold memory and bind it in the sense of a spatial practice. To walk through memory is to walk through a map of the past and to see that map projected on the future. So this mapping story became a story about past and future, about personal memory and imagined stories, because we imagine what the world will be like based on what we've had, on our what's been true to us and dear to us, but also our fears of what might happen. And climate change, post-apocalyptic narratives of climate change in particular, threaten that memory structure. And so as I worked with a fiction writer, we started to think, well, what could we do to take those stories into a kind of fantasy future?
So sort of imagining possible post-apocalyptic scenarios based, though, on your scientific data that you're collecting, or how are these two components of your work related? In other words, you're mapping the territory very accurately on the one hand, and mapping also, the effects on the territory of this, industrialization and post-industrial landscape. But at the same time, you are weaving your narratives on it. So how are they connected?
Well, that's an interesting issue, because my feeling is one of the benefits of new media is that we don't have to make everything one. That there are all these elements that are part of telling a story, the way there are stories you can tell with a poem that are different from stories you tell in a news story. There are things you can express in a dance that are different from things you can express with a great feast. But they all may relate to a common topic. And that's the case here, is that all of these are different ways of talking about what it means to be somewhere, to have a home, to have memories in a place, to go out and walk in a place. It means the things you know about the place, but also the emotions you have in the place. And so I want to find, not to force everything to be one, but to have, well, that's what we know scientifically. This is what we know historically. This is the feeling when we go out and imagine our kids playing in the field by the water. And have those all be brought together, as opposed to feeling fragmented. Have them feel like it's all part of an arc or a set. It's unifying, and meanwhile we don't feel we can also enjoy each for what it is. So in this case, we created a story that draws on the particulars about the evolution of fish maybe, or the practice of fishing, or of playing with one's children, or of memories of hunting for special treasures or whatnot along shorelines, growing food and vegetables in the backyard. Simple stories like that are the way we know the land, sometimes very personally, set against these big histories. And that allowed me not to force everything into one narrative. And I think that's
so you're working with Scott Rettberg at this project, and Scott was well known also in Italy, author of electronic literature. And how did you conceive your collaboration, and how this work? Because you're building a database for this narrative part of your work, if I understand.
That's right. Well, let me play put a bit of the image in the background as we go, and so that you can get some sense of the structure. And we'll just let this run, and I'll describe a little bit about how we imagine the structure. This has sound, there's voices in it. And the way it's constructed is I've gathered all this documentary evidence, and I've manipulated it and layered imagery on as settings that play against text. And the text includes documentary anecdotes that Scott researched about deaths during hurricanes, and fiction, in a sense almost a false documentary of people in a future time, 20 years from now or so, describing the landscape they live on, things that were lost, things that have changed. And working with Scott was very exciting because we'd done a few projects like this, imagining how catastrophes affect human relations and how shuffling video clips in a database create surprising connections between ideas. So here what we did, we took stories, little anecdotes that different individuals say in roughly 90-second to 2-minute fragments that can be mixed and matched in different ways continually as a computer plays, so that the stories keep changing, the relationship of the stories to the images keep changing. And so it's almost like the way that the ocean comes in with the tides, and it offers stories and then pulls back and offers another story. It's like time itself, familiar yet changing, familiar yet changing, and things keep shifting. So you're always surprised by relationships. And as long as there's a solid fabric of keywords, of common motifs, it binds back together. And it's a structure we had a lot of fun working with. Scott, I've been working with Scott now for several years on different projects, and this is really the development of a lot of the ideas we've been talking about.
So how interactive is from the point of view of the audience, so that you have in mind, or the different types of audience, because I'm sure that there might be multiple users of it.
This is not an interactive film, let me say. This uses a database structure, so it sets up, once you click it, it's constructed in HTML, not a difficult structure, though it's very large in its file size. Once you start it, it keeps mixing and matching, and it will play forever, and you'll never see the same film twice. Maybe you watch it for an hour and a half, you're feeling you've covered most of the bits, like a feature movie, yet every time you watch it, it will be different. And so there's a continual sense of surprise. It's ideal for a museum exhibition where it could run on a loop, but it could also go to a cinema, and every cinema screening will be a different viewing. So that you may go to a cinema and see the film, your friend may go the next day, and you've both seen something of the film, but you've both had a slightly different experience.
I see. So you're not planning, or you don't have in mind, based on this database that you are building, and just, to have a more interactive experience, guided by the user rather than by your narrative, or the multiple narratives that you're building?
That could be a different experience. We have the interactive maps. We have the interactive landscapes that we navigate, of which there's several on this website, through the Unknown Territories website, that takes you into the landscapes, into satellite imaged landscapes with text. Then we have this film experience, which is a viewership, passive viewership. It plays and you watch. And then we're developing the project for 3D cave environments. In 3D cave environments, you put on glasses, there's a joystick, and we place the user in the middle of this setting. And across that landscape in the middle may be elements like these ships or the water, and the viewer now is in the middle of the landscape. And then it develops an interactivity on the in-betweenness of being in the water, as if, I don't know, you'll need to swim, or being on the land, being out there, connected to materials that are connected to what's happening in this film. So step by step, each part functions differently, and not everything can be interactive, not everything can be a movie, but rather they all have different modes, we might say.
And different settings for showing it, etc.
Completely.
Formats, etc. So, as a kayaker myself, I'm fascinated by the point of view. As a matter of fact, this idea that the shoreline, you're at the same level of the shoreline at the same time. you can see every inch, you know, in a sense. But I have a question about this, your fascination, if we can call it a fascination with this panoramic view as a canvas, as a cognitive canvas as well. I mean, your work has been consistent, you know, exploring different ways of using it. So can you say if there is anything in particular about the panorama view that, you know, has a cognitive value in terms of, you know.
A good clip for talking about that right now, excellent, is that one of the things that I've talked about before a bit about panorama is that the 19th century panorama had this sense of omniscience. You stand in the center of the scene and you feel you can see it all because everything is continuous in space and contiguous in time by the sense that you're experiencing natural time. And in a way that sets an authority. From where you are, you have authority over the totalness, the way that's Google Map has no authority. It says this is how it all is. However, whatever your experience is, this is the total experience. Animating panorama and putting video on it breaks that up because it means that you have both the experience of the whole and all these fragments interrupt the whole, but it's not like a cut which cuts it completely. They sit side by side. You have both interrupted time experiences like portals into other times and the panorama at the same time. That undermines most film theory of the 20th century. It fundamentally destroys the opposition between mise-en-scène and the cut in cinema, fundamental building blocks of film theory. And it radically reimagines the notion of time and space, their relationship. And I don't think we've fully comprehended that transformation of our theory of time-space relationships in the image that have happened. Panorama is a great way of talking about that because it sets 19th century theory against 20th century theory, and it shows how both were constrained by particular media formats. And this someday will also go through the same critique. Right. But right now, in the moment, reevaluating those, and I find that so fascinating.
So when you think about the genealogy of panoramas, you know, the moving panoramas, do they have a, because you were talking about the kind of fixed panoramas, full, you know, sort of immersive experience or perspectival, you know, experience, but is the moving panorama typology, which has been recently studied by Eric Utamo and this big book about, and we have an example here of the Panorama Garibaldi, etc. Is that somewhat different, as more pre-cinematic in a sense, from your point of view, or?
Well, what I'm interested in is this, partly in these panoramas, is the interruptions of the space, as if working more with the surrealist notion of collage. What happens when two objects that don't necessarily belong together are put upon a surface on which they may not seem at first to belong. And suddenly that disrupts the naturalistic authority, that it's both panorama and it's surreal. It's a collage, it's a combination of all these different elements. It may be text, it may be strange audio fragments, but it may also be stuff in the image. That's a little bit different. That takes us into the relationship between what's the naturalistic representation of a land, of a landscape, and our dreams, our fantasies, our emotional connection to it, what's beyond the real, the surreal. And we project things into landscapes, and that the medium allows for that projection to these interruptions of the space.
So in a sense, this experience that you are describing is closer to the way we experience space and in a sense, maybe even the experience of you know, kayaking down the river, as opposed to how, for instance, in the Mississippi panorama, the famous panorama, which you would, you know, sort of have the train-like experience, you know, the window, the images, you know, scrolling next to you, and you know, apparently.
Yeah, it could be. I don't know how you experience space, so I can't say for the we, but I would say it's certainly I don't experience. I don't want to think my experience of space is limited by the way that those examples, like the Mississippi one, show us how space is, because our spaces are our memories of spaces, our dreams of spaces, the connections, the way that smell will throw us across time, join places that would seem to have nothing together to belong together. In this case, the rumbling sound of the pebbles on the beach, or the crashing of waves that take me back to a childhood experience, but are also mapped onto this other world. And we can't, all our knowledge has to be knowledge on top of experience we've had before. We have to learn to see, and then we learn to see again, and we learn to see again. And the neutral or distanced panorama tells us how to see. It doesn't engage us in the learning process in the same way that I'm trying to explore.
So in a sense, if I understand your way, non-naturalistic way of experiencing or perhaps describing or mapping the experience of space and our environment is also a way of coming closer to a subjective involvement with the environment, rather instead of seeing it as something detached from us that can be easily exploited, that can be easily described or mapped as a sort of an objective distance, etc. So in a sense, is this a way of reconnecting us even to
that's right, Massimo. It's, I think, in a sense, as a tool, it's also to offer people a way to think about how they record space that will be more of yourself, to be more personal. We've learned how to shoot panoramas like this one. This one I've animated now, this water flooding over it. But the naturalistic panorama, once you engage it, you can make it your own and you begin to place things on it. Almost think of the photograph as being more like a scrapbook that it's not a pristine, perfect thing, but it's more something you write up, scratch up, tear up, stick stuff on. Make it something you really have personality, your personality. I once did a film in Burgundy, very different topic, on winemakers, but I was just looking at what makes a place particular to them. And it's not the generic view, the magazine view of a vineyard from afar, but it's the daily grind of the mud, of the dirt, and different qualities of the soil. It's the way the light falls. It's the hard work of clearing out the yeasts from the barrels and what the barrels mean. It's what the clippers are in the hand. It's what each stage of the work gives the words that make people imagine not only the landscape but their life. Terms like vintage become ways of talking about when your children were born. In terms of how you work the vines become terms talking about how you hold families or communities together. It's that sense that your own stories, your own language is invested in the landscape. And that's what's also applied here, is that those pictures, those panoramas are things you break up and you make your own. They have to be worked at, because the camera doesn't do it for you. The camera makes everything nice and neat. Well, it looks nice at first, it's actually taking you out of its process. The camera's doing your memory for you. It's kind of seems a bit cheating, really, to deprive yourself of that right to go in and chop it up yourself.
I was thinking, this is a visual experience mostly, but clearly can become in a richer sensory experience once we maybe introduce new dimension. The cave, of course, would be already 3D, different kind of full immersive visual experience, but perhaps there are other ways of also introducing other elements in this collage.
Well, that's interesting. Yes, of course, this is an audio piece. We've turned down the audio now for our recording. Right. And in fact, but it's the audio is not just the voices, it's the sounds of the water, the sounds of the ships.
Ambient sound.
Exactly. Right. But when you think of other environments, cave and making it 3D is one step. Other sensory experience is also extremely interesting. It's very hard to work with different sensory experience, but settings also create a different ambience. Taking this kind of work and projecting it out by a water area, out on the docks, where you smell the water and the salt and you hear the seagulls and so forth, changes how you watch the film. And I think that's a very exciting aspect of working with panoramic work, where you can find big walls to work with and project work, And it brings in these also these extra elements, hard to fabricate.
Fascinating. I have a question, last question perhaps, is this is a project that has engaged you for a long time. It is a very long process to create, and you conceive it as an open process, something that can go on forever, or is something that can maybe meet other forms of collaboration and perhaps dissemination that is not necessarily entirely controlled by you as an author or generated by you, but picked up by other people in similar circumstances. I'm thinking, there are several examples in Italy, beginning with non-fiction writers who have explored the landscape as in a travelogue, travel writers who have described the landscape, and then of course documentary has been added to that dimension, and then of course the idea that you can map a territory with the help of people who come to the web and send in their own photographs and enrich this this whole database of different ways of remapping our environment, etc. So is this something, this particular project, something that you see as at some point reaching a completion, or something that and in general probably your projects sort of are connected to some level, certainly?
It's a great question. That's part of having different elements to it and also being collaborative. I love collaborating, and this kind of work is very hard to do without different collaborations. And there are areas I would love to have expanded in this way. The mapping using Google Map or Drupal, which is an open source, is very effective for creating a format that people can add to the map as time goes on. And that's a resource I hope will grow. Hopefully there won't be horrible catastrophes, but even small things as people watch change along the river, that this could be, that the map could be something that gets added to and built upon. The film project I expect will come to a conclusion. It's very difficult to work with tremendously large video and video files as I am doing. The film project will probably itself wrap up like other film projects, but the model is a model that can be applied to other projects, just as this model grew out of a previous combinatory structure and bears resemblance to other films I've made. So different elements take on different forms. The topics, which is spatial practice, right now are a lot to do with climate change, but also to do with other related topics, pollution and industry, how we walk, how we know a place and map it, how we build memory, how those are threatened by what's going on globally. Those are topics that find different homes. I'd worked in the American Southwest on these topics. I'm working here. My next challenge, I think, will be also to go back to England, where I did some initial photography in Kent, tried to put together a photo study and work there with people I know there, hopefully develop some other collaborations on that area, or maybe some other European ports.
How about Venice? I mean, I was mentioning Venice.
Well, there's another
that would
city
be a big project.
and it would be very interesting to see different projects along these themes, all
Right.
clustered together in some set, because this is by no means only a local project here or in England. It's a global issue.
But you think, though, this is the very last question, do you think that you need to have some sort of a personal connection to the landscape in order to be really engaging in such a project, or you think that this is a format, let's say, or something, a form, more than a format that you can then perhaps use as a template for, as you said, for different things, but you need to bring in, we were talking about oral storytelling before, and sort of direct experience of the landscape in order for it to come together. I mean,
a lot of my training was in anthropological participant observation, and one of the lessons I appreciated most from anthropology, and ethnography in particular, was you have to first be there on the ground and get your hands dirty in the soil to know the soil, and that you begin from the particulars of a place and the particulars of being somewhere. And that I've always been opposed to the kind of projects, documentary, journalist, and so forth, that go from the outside, take some images and take them away. And so I try to promote models that are all about being there, engaging, spending time in a place, whether it's me or someone else. You know, the models are easily adaptable by other people. It's that the lessons take a long time to learn. You don't learn in 2 weeks. You learn over years. This project's taken 2 or 3 years of kayaking and walking every foot of the coast of 2 different places, large places. And that gathering, it takes time. And it develops an intimacy that you can't get just coming in and coming out. And other people, everyone has different ways they connect to those places. So it becomes richer the more you can layer that in, and that again can be collaborative. It doesn't all have to be layered into one project, but that projects that we find ways to cluster projects to say, this project relates to what so-and-so says about the river, and this set of oral histories, and that set of writing, and this set of music. And all of these are ways of talking about one issue, and then another cluster on another issue, and maybe they connect here and there, so that we develop a different way of gathering information, of which then this becomes just one part of some set that gets collected.
Great. Thank you very much. That was terrific.
Thanks, it's been a great pleasure.